Okay, the numbers are fairly stable now, so I think we'll just start. Welcome again to this session of the Energy Academy. Your hosts today are myself, Keith Patterson, and my colleague Isabella van Green. We are part of the Brody's energy team, and we in particular focus on renewable and low carbon energy. I am the co-head of our renewable energy group, and Isabella is an associate in our energy and infrastructure team. Today's session is about hydrogen, and in particular about the emerging regulatory environment. Hydrogen looks as though it will form a key plank of the energy transition. Indeed, hydrogen has been hyped as the transition fuel. We've had renewables and we've got renewables and we'll continue to deploy them, but we need fuels to replace fossil fuels. And either pure hydrogen or hydrogen-derived fuels such as ammonia look to be the ones that are going to fill that gap. In particular, it's been identified for use in energy-intensive industries and as a transport fuel. Of course, for hydrogen to become the clean fuel of the future, a new regulatory framework needs to be established to support it. And we're pretty much doing that from scratch. And that's the topic of today's discussion. It is still new and it's not yet in place, but the direction of travel is becoming clear. Isabella will first take us through the emerging framework for licensing and safety, and I will then talk about low carbon certification and its link to the subsidy framework that's being put in place and will be put in place for hydrogen. So Isabella, over to you.
Thanks, Keith. So to start with, I'm going to talk about the licensing regime that applies for the production, supply, transportation and storage of hydrogen, and that's in a onshore and offshore context. So if we go to my first slide, thank you. Let's talk about the existing regulatory landscape. So at the moment, there's no comprehensive regulatory framework that applies specifically to hydrogen. Instead, there's a patchwork of legislation that was introduced before hydrogen was even really a thing. And now it's seen as a facilitator to achieving net zero. So this means that there are legislative gaps that need to be filled, as well as adjustments required to existing regulation in order to bring the law up to speed with the technology. Now, in the next few minutes, I'll take you through key parts of this legislation and talk about the government's proposals on future hydrogen-specific regulation. So on the next slide, I'm going to cover the current regulatory regime that applies onshore. So let's start with production. At the moment, there is no requirement on a party to obtain a license to produce hydrogen onshore. That said, you are likely to need an environmental permit and planning permission, and both of these things will contain some conditions. And those conditions will apply to operators operating a hydrogen plant onshore. On supply, if you're wanting to supply or transport hydrogen through a pipeline, you'll be required to obtain a transporter license, and these are issued by Ofgem. Strictly speaking, Ofgem could put any sort of condition on these licenses, provided that it's acting in accordance with its duties. But in reality, they tend to publish these conditions on its website. So future hydrogen transporters will be able to get a good idea of the sort of conditions that are likely to apply to that kind of license. Onto storage. Under the town and country planning regulations, consent is required from a planning authority to store 2 tons or more of hydrogen. If you're applying for that kind of consent, you'll be required to submit certain supporting evidence. That will be things like details of how and where hydrogen will be kept and used, the main activities to be carried out on the site, and the measures taken to limit the consequences of a major accident. So those are the key consents and licenses that are applicable to onshore hydrogen projects at the moment. Just before we move on to the next slide, it's worth noting that there's a whole host of other health and safety legislation that applies to onshore hydrogen projects, but I'll cover that later on in the presentation. Okay, so on this slide, I'm going to cover the current regulatory regime that applies to hydrogen offshore. Again, I'll use the same format, so let's start with production first. under the Marine Act 2010, a party wishing to construct, alter or improve any works within the Scottish marine licensing area will require a marine licence. So, for example, if you wanted to install an electrolyser offshore, you would need to obtain a marine licence. For supply, there's nothing that specifically applies to offshore hydrogen projects, but depending on the particular circumstances of your project, you might need a transporter licence from Ofgem. For storage, similarly, for the storage of offshore hydrogen, it's not dealt with under existing legislation, and this is one of the gaps that I'm referring to. But I think in the foreseeable future, this is likely to change, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. But before I go on to that, I think it's worth reiterating at this stage that the key takeaway is that there's no body of rules that specifically applies to hydrogen, and so there is a need in the future to change the current legislation and to introduce new legislation in order to deal with the nuances of hydrogen production, supply and storage. Okay, if we move on, thank you. So with that in mind, I think it's useful to discuss two key proposals that have been made by the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. Firstly, extending the legislation that applies currently to gas pipeline construction. I'm sure that many of our listeners today will be aware that this is governed by the Petroleum Act, and that if you want to construct a subsea pipeline in the UK continental shelf or territorial seas, perhaps for the transportation of oil or natural gas or even carbon dioxide, then this Petroleum Act requires you to obtain a pipeline works authorisation from the North Sea Transition Authority. So that's the background of legislation as it is now. The Department for Energy's proposal is to extend this regime so that it applies to hydrogen, meaning that potentially in the future developers of hydrogen projects will, similarly to the oil and gas industry, be required to obtain a PWA. The other proposal made by the Department for Energy is to extend the application of the gas storage licensing regime. Again, I'm sure that most of our listeners will know that under this regime, offshore gas storage facilities are a licensable activity under the offshore gas storage regulations, and that at the moment the definition of gas in the Energy Act doesn't include hydrogen, and therefore these regs do not cover hydrogen. But this is where the Department for Energy's next proposal comes into play. They're proposing to change this so that developers of hydrogen projects are required to obtain a license from the NSTA to store hydrogen offshore. So I suppose both of these proposals go some way towards filling the gaps in regulations relating to the construction of hydrogen gas pipelines and storage of gas offshore. But what's really interesting about these proposals is that they do not provide a regulatory framework for offshore hydrogen production. And the Department for Energy does acknowledge this, and it has commented that further developments are required. But for now, at least, it seems their plan is to extend the current offshore oil and gas regulatory framework to create a hydrogen regulatory framework, meaning that there are some gaps in the meantime. Okay, blending. So as a reminder to listeners, when we talk about blending, we mean the injection of hydrogen into the existing natural gas pipeline network. And at the moment, there's a limitation on the concentration of hydrogen that can be in a natural gas pipeline. It's 0.1%, which I think is probably a barrier to the development of some hydrogen projects. But nonetheless, blending is seen as a good way of overcoming, at least in the interim, the fact that there is currently no dedicated hydrogen pipeline network. The good news is that it's been recommended by the Energy Networks Association that this 0.1% limit is increased to 20%, and we have seen examples of that limitation being removed, and some projects receiving an exemption from the HSE to inject up to 20% of hydrogen into a natural gas pipeline. So I think this is something that we will see granted increasingly more. Moving on to the safety regime. So I'll talk about the health and safety legislation that applies to hydrogen gas transportation, supply and storage. It's worth saying at the outset that, and this is kind of a continuing theme, that there's no health and safety legislation that's specific to hydrogen, nor is there any in the pipeline. That said, there are a number of existing safety regulations that will apply to hydrogen, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. So I've included some of what I think are the most key regulations that will apply to hydrogen projects, and I'll briefly go through each of these and summarize what those pieces of legislation govern. So let's start with the carriage of dangerous goods regulations. So these, unsurprisingly, apply to the carriage of dangerous goods. And that includes hydrogen, whether travelling by road or rail. And these regulations place health and safety duties on each party that has a role in transporting goods. The next one there is the Independent Gas Transporter Uniform Network Code. And the gas transporter license that I mentioned earlier that includes conditions. One of those conditions will likely be on a licensee to comply with this code. And the headline for this one is that it's intended to harmonise the network code arrangements of independent gas transporters. Similarly, the Uniform Network Code will also need to be complied with as a condition on the gas transport licence. And this code sets out the common rules governing transportation arrangements between licensed gas transporters and shippers. Continuing clockwise around the circle, we then have the pressure equipment safety regulations, and these apply when transporting hydrogen by road. The key takeaway for this one is that it sets out specific design requirements for tanks, cylinders, and tubes that are used when transporting hydrogen. And then we have the pipeline safety regulations. These place an obligation on a party transporting hydrogen to comply with certain standards when they're designing and constructing, maintaining, decommissioning a pipeline. And then last but not least, we have the gas safety management regulations. And these require transporters of gas to submit a safety case to the Health and Safety Executive. And this safety case needs to identify the hazards and risks that are going to be on the site, together with an explanation of how they're going to be managed and mitigated. Okay, and then we have COMA. So this is the final slide on safety. And COMA stands for the Control of Major Accident Hazards regime. It does apply to the storage of hydrogen. And it requires, broadly speaking, it requires operators to take all necessary measures to prevent major accidents and to limit the consequences for human health and the environment. And the regime works by splitting sites into two different divisions. You've got your lower tier and you've got your upper tier sites. You might be wondering what determines what tier you go in. Well, for a lower tier site, it's if you're storing hydrogen in a quantity of less than 50 tonnes. And for an upper tier site, it's 50 tonnes plus. Upper tier sites reflect that they're riskier and therefore are required to comply with more onerous obligations relating to health and safety. So just to give you a few examples, I've set them out in the table, but just to give you a flavour of that, for lower tier and upper tier sites, you need to take all measures necessary to prevent major accidents. You need to prepare a major accident prevention policy. For an upper tier site, you've also got to submit a safety report, and you've got to review and test an internal emergency plan. Okay, so there's your whistle-stop tour of health and safety regulation that applies to hydrogen projects. And that's all from me for now. So I'll hand you back to Keith, who's going to talk about low carbon and subsidies.
Hi there, thanks, Isabella. That was very clear. So clear, in fact, we only have one question so far, so which is a very good question. But I would encourage you all to post some questions in the Q&A. I'm sure it was all very, very clear from Isabella, but there must be one or two questions. And so just to move on to the second part of this, so I'm going to look at the low carbon aspect of this and how the regulatory framework is going to try and get the hydrogen industry or market started. So the first thing about that is certification, or the low carbon standard, and the second part of that is more about the subsidy framework itself. But just think about the low carbon standard and the need for a standard. The policy objectives of the UK government are twofold. The first and more limited objective is to decarbonise existing hydrogen production. There is some at the moment. It is very limited to a number of industrial uses. The second objective is the key one to the energy transition, and that's to substitute fossil fuel use with low carbon hydrogen as an alternative fuel that is clean and low carbon. And this is the one that's really going to affect the energy transition. And that's the bit where you're starting a market in effect from nothing. And as we all know, at the moment, the cost of producing low carbon hydrogen is higher than the cost of producing high carbon hydrogen or fossil fuels. And therefore, the only way in which we can start the market is by subsidising producers to produce it. And the aim, and the stated aim of the government, is to increase demand by reducing the cost of supply. So it effectively enables you to substitute. Now, they're not planning to provide subsidy that will make it cheaper than fossil fuels, just the same cost, and that everybody will then have a sufficient incentive to switch across. That remains to be seen, but that is the current objective of government. Subsidies, of course, then need to be linked to a low carbon characteristic, and therefore you need to define low carbon. I think it's also fair to say that in creating a new market, regulatory certainty is a precondition to establishing the confidence that is required. Investors require confidence that the regulatory environment they see before them is not going to chop and change all the assumptions they've made in their investment case. And the UK government has historically been good at doing that, and it is, I think, taking a lead in this area when you look at comparable progress in the rest of the world, at least as regards to the regulatory regime. And the low carbon standard is, of course, going to be an essential component of the new regulatory standard. And thank you. It's worth, I think, just taking a step back before going into exactly how you create a low carbon standard for hydrogen, is to understand all the different forms of hydrogen. There are principally three, but in fact also many more, and for some reason we all call hydrogen bicolours. I don't know where that practice is established from, but it's certainly become standard practice now. So grey is what we currently generally use as the most abundant form of current hydrogen production, and that's made from methane. by steam reforming methane. And there are significant CO2 emissions associated with that. Blue hydrogen is essentially the same as grey, except that you apply carbon capture technology. And there are various types of carbon capture technology, but you essentially take what you currently do and apply the carbon capture technology on top of that. And that doesn't result in zero emissions. It's impossible to capture all of the carbon, and is likely to be around 10%, give or take, depending upon the technology. But it captures about 90% of the emissions. So it's a very significant difference to grey in terms of its emissions. It's worth noting, of course, that not only do you need the carbon capture technology, you need other carbon capture and storage technology to first of all transport that carbon dioxide and then to store it. And that's one of the areas where the UK continental shelf has an advantage, because it can be stored in depleted oil wells and oil and gas wells. Green hydrogen is made from water by electrolysis. You basically split the water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen. It is therefore, the process itself is entirely clean. The only emissions are oxygen. And the extent to which it is low carbon will ultimately be dependent upon how low carbon or renewable that electricity is. If it's 100% renewables, then the production itself will be entirely without emissions, although of course there will be some emissions related to some of the processes, supply chain processes and infrastructure. Worth noting, when it comes to hydrogen, you're also going to hear a few other colours. Black is made from coal, brown from lignite, pink or sometimes purple is from nuclear, yellow from solar, although to my mind pink and yellow are very similar to green because they're essentially electrolysis, and green is a kind of an all-encompassing term. And then turquoise, which is relatively new, methane pyrolysis, and could be potentially used within biomass type projects. So the UK approach to regulation. So I'm going to deal with the UK approach and the EU approach, and I'll come on to why that's the case in a minute. But the UK approach is to seek to create a single overall standard for all hydrogen production. And they've set, and therefore they've come up with a figure which is the boundary between low carbon and high carbon. And that's greenhouse gas emissions intensity of up to, but not more than 20 grams of CO2 per megajoule of produced hydrogen. Now, if you thought that was simple, then the formula in the next bullet point shows you that it's not quite so simple. And this is the formula for calculating the emissions that are involved in the production of hydrogen. And this is to do with the feedstock supply, energy supply, all of your input materials, processes, all of the infrastructure, carbon capture, sequestration, etc. So while it is a single maximum emissions threshold for all colours of hydrogen, that formula shows you that it needs to apply in quite different ways to different types of hydrogen. But the objective in taking this approach is to help encourage innovation. If developers and innovators know the standard they need to meet, then they know that they can make investment with the view that if they achieve a certain standard, then they're going to be able to achieve investment and roll out their technology. And there's more than one technology for both green and blue, and there will be others that develop, and there will be sophistications of those existing technologies as they develop over time, just as we've seen in the renewable sector. In particular, though, when it comes to blue, you are measuring the emissions from the production, but also all the associated carbon capture, storage processes, and the compression and purification. That's essentially a kind of a supply chain calculation. With green hydrogen, it is somewhat more complicated. If we get to the future in 2035, the UK hopes to have achieved a net zero electricity system. So the energy system is 2050 for net zero, but for the electricity it's 2035. If we achieve that, at that point, if you're connected to the grid, then essentially your hydrogen production will be zero emissions. But that's not the case today. So the question is, how do you calculate green emission or CO2 or GHG emissions in the meantime? And the easiest way to do that is you have your hydrogen production facility, your electrolyzer, connected to a standalone wind farm or solar project or combination of those, and that's the only place they receive any electricity from. The other way is that you connect to the grid, but you are able to monitor the source of energy that you're buying and demonstrate in real time, that's every 30 minutes, that your renewable source of electricity that you're buying from is in fact generating at that moment in time. And if that's not the case, then you'll just use, or what's substituted is the actual national grid average GHG intensity. So in other words, if you want to have an effective green project, I mean, if you just connect it to an on-site production, renewables production, it's going to be hard to achieve 100% utilization of your project. So you might want, in addition to that, to also to be connected to the grid and potentially to be importing, but want to be importing green energy. So you'll need to have a power purchase agreement that allows you to demonstrate that you are purchasing in real time renewable energy at that moment of production when you're not getting production from your on-site renewables. And that's going to be a bit of a challenge. The market's still trying to work out exactly how it's going to do that. A couple of things from that is in order to get your subsidy, evidence is going to be critical. You can see for both blue and green, they're going to be continuing, there are going to be emissions associated with the construction of those projects, but then also with the ongoing operation, and they're going to have to be satisfied on a continuing basis throughout the life of the subsidy. Next slide, please. So the EU approach to regulation, why do I mention that? Well, I think it's worth noting that, and this was in the immediate aftermath of the start of the Ukraine war, the EU changed its approach to hydrogen goals. And those goals are now to produce 10 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen by 2030. So that's produced within the EU, but also to import 10 gigawatts of renewable energy. Now that could be from Africa, but it could equally be from the UK, and in particular from the UK and Norway in the North Sea. So what that represents is, and of course 2030 is just, if you like, your initial target. There will be many, the amount of capacity that's going to be required is many multiples more than 10 or 20 gigawatts. And therefore there is an opportunity for developers in Scotland to produce hydrogen not just for the UK market, but also for particularly the German and Dutch markets, which are high industry users. And what the EU have said is that the same standards will be applied to imported hydrogen as to hydrogen produced within the EU. And as I say, it presents an opportunity for Scotland. The approach that the EU is taking is slightly different. They've have more focus on renewable hydrogen than we do in the UK. We are agnostic to blue and green. The EU is very much in favour of renewable, but that's not to say that they are completely against low carbon hydrogen. and there's been a debate on that, and they have passed 2 delegated acts, one which focuses on renewable hydrogen and one which focuses on low carbon. At the moment, their import target refers to renewable hydrogen, and so that's the one that presents the most immediate opportunity to Scotland, but there could well be possibilities in the future that blue hydrogen produced in Scotland will also be available, or will also be permitted to be imported into the EU. But of course, it's going to have to meet not UK standards, but EU standards. And they've got a slightly different approach to it. In particular, one of the differences on renewables is that it must be produced from additional renewables, or from a region that generates 90% of its electricity from renewables, which basically means up to 2030 it's got to be additional renewables, apart from a small bit of Sweden, apparently. But I think for projects developing in Scotland, they may well have an eye to both UK regulation and EU regulation, as indeed I suspect businesses do generally, but it's going to apply here too. Next slide, please. So in the subsidy framework, so I mean that's the standard that's going to be required if you want to access any of these subsidies. The subsidy here is going to talk primarily about capex and revenue support. Next slide, please. So the capex support in the UK is called the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund. There's 4 strands to it. It's basically trying to provide support for both DevEx and CapEx, so the development of initial projects and supporting the feed and indeed post-feed studies, but essentially trying to get a project up to ready to build stage, and then also looking at capital expenditure. The first 2 strands were very much for projects that are not going to be supported or obtain revenue support, and in a way that was to kind of kickstart a few initial projects in the UK, and there are quite a few. You can go onto the Department of Energy website, and there's quite a few projects that are being supported at the moment with varying amounts of money. So I think it's being effective in terms of helping to kickstart a few projects. Strand 3 is really about capital expenditure to support projects that will seek revenue support, or HBM. That's I'll come on to that in the next slide. The hydrogen business model, as it's sometimes referred to, and then strand 4 is for effectively for capex support for blue projects. So it will be possible to get some capital expenditure support for a project you then also apply for revenue support on. Next slide, thanks. So the revenue support, this is going to become, so the capex support was good for the kickstarting the market, but I think we can expect that to be retired over time. The revenue support framework, that's the key one. This is the one that is truly going to support the creation of the hydrogen industry in the UK, or low carbon hydrogen industry in the UK. And as we talked about before, it is agnostic to blue and green. It's going to support both. It is known as the hydrogen business model. In fact, it looks very similar to the renewables contract for difference, or CFD. I don't know how familiar everybody is with the renewable CFD, but certainly if you have had the opportunity or the pleasure of reading that 500-page contract, you'll see quite a few similarities between that and the hydrogen contract that is being developed at the moment. The basic principle is very similar, although there are some differences in the way it applies, which I'll come to. But the essence of it is there's a reference price which is essentially a market price, and then there's the agreed strike price, and that's the price that you agree with the government that you need in order to produce hydrogen on a profitable, sustainable basis. So to the extent that the reference price or the market price is less than the strike price, you then get the difference between the two and you receive that as a payment. If that reference price is higher than the strike price, then you pay back that. And if you look at the renewable CFD in the early days, the market price was always lower than the strike price, or nearly always lower than the strike price. But now there's been many instances, particularly during the winter, of course, when the strike price was much lower than the market price, and so there was a lot of money paid back to the UK government under that CFD. So while this will start off similarly, and it will support payments to the hydrogen producers over the 15-year course of the contract, that may change. The reference price, the benchmark price, what is that going to be? It's basically going to be the natural gas price. The government don't want you to then strike an achieved price that's higher than that and then pocket the difference. So if you achieve a price with a buyer and it's higher than the natural gas price, then you'll only get the difference between the market price and the achieved price. Of course, if you just put it and leave it at that, then every end user is just going to contract at the natural gas price, and indeed there's every incentive to contract at the natural gas price because that's the price that they currently pay. So that makes a lot of sense. But for some parties, there might be some benefits from a brand perspective in using hydrogen and being zero carbon, and therefore they may be prepared to pay a small premium, and the government has offered or does allow producers to keep 10% of any uplift beyond the natural gas price that they might get in agreeing an achieved price with a buyer. At the moment, the agreed strike price isn't negotiated, it's just negotiated. It will, like CFDs in the renewable sector, it will be auctioned in the future, and it'll essentially be the bid price. It'll probably use the clearing price, which means that everybody gets the highest bid price that is accepted, which is the way it works in the renewables sector, and I expect it to be the same here, although I don't know that we've got clarity on that just yet. But it's worth saying as a model, it does support production and producers. They've got certainty on their price risk, but it also protects taxpayers and end users, because if price does get higher, then there is that payback obligation as well. Lastly, on the subsidy framework, I was just going to talk about a few of the key risks to the revenue support. Again, this will pick up some of the nuanced differences between this and the renewable support. One is counterparty risk. It is essential that you have at least one buyer, and you retain one buyer who's buying some of your hydrogen production. If not, then you lose all support, which will be seen as a risk for the investor community, no doubt. But that's where we are at the moment. In the renewable sector, there was something called the off-taker of last resort. So if you couldn't find a buyer for your electricity, then somebody, an electricity supplier, would be mandated to buy your electricity. Now that's never been used, and that's never had to be used. The market has functioned and continues to function well in that regard. There isn't a similar concept here. It wouldn't be so easy in any case, because there's no grid into which to inject your supply, so it's not so easy to put in place that support. The other counterparty risk that's worth bearing in mind is you can't have intermediary buyers. The UK government at the moment are only going to support actual users of hydrogen, so they don't want traders who will then trade that in the future. That's partly that's driven by the fact that they want to achieve a reduction in emissions. They want to make sure that the buyers actually buy it and use the hydrogen to displace fossil fuel use. But it does mean that the market is a little less liquid. So we'll need to monitor that one and see where the government go with that. That may change over time. Sales volume risk. Now, in addition to completely losing all your sales, it may just be that you reduce your sales. So you may lose one buyer, or you may sell less. And in that case, this risk is supported by the framework. And essentially, if the amount of your sales fall, then the price per tonne that you receive for your production will increase, so that you still retain profitability. I don't think it's 100% protection, but it provides you with sufficient protection, or at least it's aimed to provide sufficient protection to make your continuing production sustainable. The other bit which is related to that is demand variability risk. So it may be that your buyer's supply will not be constant, may vary, and therefore you have an overall lifetime cap, the amount that you can produce and get benefit for, and you can go above it, but you just won't get support for it. And then you have an annual cap, which will be higher than the lifetime cap divided by 15, so that you effectively can have higher production in a year, so that you can manage your demand flows to try and maximize your return. So those are the things that they've tried to do to protect investors as much as possible without having that buyer of last resort. A couple of the other key risks: renewable power availability risk for hydrogen or green hydrogen producers. I think this is just how do you make your project as efficient as possible when a single renewable source is unlikely to support full utilization of your electrolyzer. So that'll be an interesting one to see how projects get developed. In that regard, it may be on-site production plus PPA, an import PPA from a pumped storage hydro scheme, for example. Network availability risk for blue hydrogen producers. So, I mean, it may be that the connection to the CO2 network is down, and that means that you can't capture your emissions, and hydrogen production is not low carbon. Again, that is a risk that developers will need to manage. And indeed, there's a technology risk there, because you will need to, blue hydrogen producers will need to show each year that they are capturing the amount of CO2 that they said they were going to capture, or at least demonstrate the amount that they're capturing is within the permitted amounts, or the amounts permitted by the contract. And that's a bit of technology risk, both in terms of its initial capture and how it performs over time. So there are a few technical design issues in terms of projects for both blue and green that do need to be addressed and refined over the first few projects, in order to work out the most efficient ways to produce low carbon hydrogen. So I think, is that us on to questions now? I think so. Yes. So there was a question for you, Isabella. I think it's quite an interesting question. And I think you did allude to the difficulties of answering this question in your presentation. But the question is, and it's good to recap this, I think, who would grant the offshore license for installing the electrolyzers?
Yeah, that is a good question. Without sounding too much like a politician, it does depend on the circumstances of your particular project. If, for example, you're installing that electrolyzer on a wind turbine platform, and that offshore wind farm was within the 12 nautical miles off the coastline of Scotland, so in the Scottish territorial seas, then you would need to obtain that license from Marine Scotland licensing operations team. If it's outside of that, then it becomes a bit more uncertain, and it goes back to the point that there's a gap in legislation at the moment about hydrogen production offshore, and the Department for Energy hasn't really signposted what they're going to do about that. So it'll be interesting to see how that policy develops over the next coming years.
And can I just add to that? I think it's worth just drawing the distinction between installing and producing. So installing, that will definitely be within the marine license. So if for example you're building a wind farm offshore, you need a marine license for that, and any installation offshore. So if there's an electrolyzer being built there, the installation part of it will require a marine license. Production, as Isabella says, is something that isn't yet covered. My expectation would be it will be similar to renewables. So a renewables offshore wind farm, for example, will have a license for the generation of electricity in a similar way to an onshore wind farm. I suspect that what we'll see is a similar license that you would get for onshore electrolyzer production for offshore, but that remains to be seen, and it could fall within the NSTA remit. But certainly the storage and transportation of the hydrogen as then produced will be governed by licensing from the NSTA. So it could be that there's a multi-party or a multi-regulator approach to it. We'll need to see. And then I've got a question on the green hydrogen standard, which I'll come to, but someone's just posted a good question, I think is related to this one, which is what would be the role of Crown Estate? And I expect you mean Crown Estate Scotland and the overlapping of governance. And so I think that's a good question, Isabella. So we have the licensing regime, and then we have Crown Estate, who in the renewable sector have certain statutory rights in relation to the renewable energy zone, but also own the territorial sea, or the seabed beneath the territorial sea, I should say.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I think if you take an example of if you want to install a pipeline offshore, if it's within the territorial seas, you'd be looking to get the agreement of Crown Estate Scotland, and if you you'd also need to obtain a license from the North Sea Transition Authority, whether it's in the territorial sea or on the UK continental shelf.
So I think, yes. So in other words, you probably need an NSTA license for the pipeline, but you may also want to get a lease from the Crown Estate in relation to the component of that pipeline that travels across the 12 nautical mile zone of the territorial sea. Mm-hmm. It is one thing that's worth bearing in mind at the moment. We've just had oil and gas in the North Sea. We've got the emergence of offshore wind farms and lots of electricity cables, oil and gas pipelines. We're going to have CO2 pipelines potentially, or certainly repurposed pipelines, hydrogen pipelines, it's going to become a lot busier. It's going to be a lot more crossing. So I think developers need to pay attention to all the rights they need from the various holders of rights in relation to the different parts of the sea. The next question we've got is for the green hydrogen standard. Does any UK regulation penalise producing electrolytic hydrogen from the grid when it is carbon intensive? So, for example, can a project produce green hydrogen 50% of the time and grey electrolytic hydrogen the rest of the time without affecting the 50% green? And there's certainly tolerance. So at the moment we've got that single standard for the low carbon hydrogen standard applies to green and to blue. So if you're green and imagine you have only renewable electricity, yes, you'll have some construction supply chain GHG emissions, but essentially you'll be at 0 rather than 20 grams. So you've got room for maneuver there, and you will be able to import electricity that will be counted as being the national average for renewables at that moment in time. Now, if your renewables are not online at that moment in time, it probably means that that electricity is fairly grey. But it's certainly possible to do that. And the other thing I think is to bear in mind is it's not a cliff edge. You don't lose everything when you go above the required emissions. You might ultimately end up with termination if you do it too much, but it's not a cliff edge. So yes, it's going to be possible to do that. I don't think it'll be 50-50, but it'll be possible to produce a electrolytic hydrogen that is say 80 and 90% green, but there'll be 10 to 20% grey and still be able to benefit from the subsidy. I think the details on that aren't fixed yet, but I think there will be that it looks like it's going to be a possibility. One last question. We've got 6 minutes left. One last question. Which is an interesting one. Well, there's probably a need to have a forum where all these regulatory entities coordinate the sequencing of permitting, licensing and leasing. Who should coordinate such efforts? I don't know if you've got a view on that, Isabella. I suspect the developers are going to have to end up coordinating all of the permits and licenses that they need to obtain. I think what's important is that there is that they dovetail and that there's not unfortunate overlaps between them. But certainly I think, and it could, for example, for offshore electrolytic production, it may well be the case that it makes sense for the NSTA to license that as well as storage and transportation, because basically there's no point in producing hydrogen at the sea without the transportation and the storage. So it makes sense on that level that they should also license the production. So there may be scope to influence government at the moment to make sure that the regulatory regime is as friendly and user-friendly and as possible. So, but I doubt we'll get to a point where there's an overall coordinator of these things. And Isabella, anything to add on that?
No, I agree. I think there's a lot of different parties that have interest in this, and different bodies that are governing slightly different aspects of future hydrogen projects, and it does make complete sense for these parties to coordinate. So we have a joined up legislation and policy implementation in terms of, you know, in reality, who is going to be the party that's coordinating it. Honest answer is I don't know. I know the Department for Energy is making efforts to consult with all of these parties, but in terms of a forum being set up, I think it's probably developers that are going to need to drive this change, because it's developers that are being affected by it at the end of the day.
One last question, I think, is a good one. It's just come on. What progress is being made to align the renewable CFD with the hydrogen subsidy, particularly for co-located sites? It's a good point. How do the various subsidies interface? I've got two minutes left, so I'll give you a brief answer. I think it is possible, I think, to have a renewable CFD for your wind farm, let's say, which then sells power to the hydrogen producer next door, and for the hydrogen producer to have a hydrogen subsidy. There will be issues, I think, in how you align the two, because what your hydrogen subsidy, they want to buy as cheap as possible. So unless that renewables, one thing the renewable CFD does, it does two things really. In the early days, it was really and truly a subsidy, because the strike price was generally speaking higher than the market price. But as time has passed and the strike prices have fallen, the market price is often higher, and so what the CFD gives you is price certainty. And if all you're getting is price certainty, you may not want that. It may not suit if you're going to produce hydrogen on site, you may want to just buy electricity at the market price, because the price of electricity is generally correlated with the price of natural gas at the moment, and if your subsidy is correlated with the price of natural gas, you may not want it to be fixed. You may want your electricity price to actually correlate with the market price. So I think it's not an easy answer as to whether you actually want that renewable CFD or not. Is one to debate, I think. So that is us. That we are just finishing up now. That's the hour. So thank you very much for listening. Our contacts are there. If you've got any further questions you would like to ask us, please feel free to do so. But yeah, once again, just thanks for listening.
Thanks.